Good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Nice to be back with y'all. Um, I hope you've seen our new website, and I hope you're pleased with it. We're really excited about it, really psyched up about it. Please go check it out, and thank you for your great support in helping us put this thing together. And also, this let you know this month we're going to be sending out our end of year fundraising letters. Hope you'll give that your careful attention. If you've donated to us in the past, I want you to know how grateful we are. We couldn't do our work without those of you that support us. Our work depends on your donations, and we try to put your money to good use and where you get a lot of bang for your buck. And so that'll be going online as well as going out in print if you're on our mailing list. And also news, we've got new staff member, full-time staff member, Sheldon Richmond. He's been, of course, senior fellow with the Future of Freedom Foundation for umpteen years. But he recently left the Foundation for Economic Education, where he had been editor of the Freeman for 15 years. And before that, he was senior editor at the Cato Institute. And so we decided to pick him up as a full-time member of the FFF staff, and we're really psyched about this. He's going to be taking over the editorship of Future of Freedom, formerly called Freedom Daily. Bart Frazier and I will continue handling the FFF Daily, which we called the FF Email Update previously. So lots of positive changes here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, and you have our pledge that we will continue working hard to advance liberty. And I thought I'd talk to you tonight in that vein in terms of mostly of economic liberty, but put it in a larger context. Specifically, this nonsense of the fiscal cliff and how the mainstream media is going ape and ballistic, over the fiscal cliff. Like there's this cliff where if you go over it, you're going to die. I mean, because they never tell you how high the cliff is, but presumably it's more than like 2 or 3 feet. Because they make it sound like, oh my gosh. I mean, it's the same thing that you get from the mainstream press, which consists of statists. I mean, let's face it, you're not going to find libertarians writing the editorials in the mainstream newspapers or the main commentaries and so forth. Yeah, you get a libertarian perspective here and there, but very rarely do they have libertarians on staff, including among the reporters. And so you get this nonsense of, oh gosh, the fiscal cliff. You get it with the debt ceiling. Every time the debt ceiling's it's coming up due, and the government's prohibited from accumulating more debt than the ceiling permits. The mainstream press just goes ballistic and says, oh my gosh, it's the height of irresponsibility to hold this up. There's got to be a deal. People have to be reasonable. They have to compromise. And then when the deal is struck, all these statists go back laughing because they don't say, hey, maybe we ought to slash spending now in anticipation of the next time the ceiling comes up, the new ceiling. No, they just laugh and say, keep spending, keep spending. Then when the ceiling comes up the next time, they go through the same charade. So I want to talk to you about this charade, this fraud tonight, because it's important. I mean, it's actually critically important. It affects, the stakes are so high, it affects you, your family, your friends and neighbors, our country, because we all know that federal spending is out of control. No one will deny that. I mean, well, yeah, okay, a few statists say, oh, it's not a problem, just keep spending. But most people acknowledge that federal spending is out of control. And there really doesn't seem to be any, positive way to resolve this in the future. They won't listen to us libertarians. I mean, we've got the solution, but they're not going to listen to us libertarians. The statists are in control. The American people continue to defer to the statists, trusting in their judgment. Now, there's big exceptions to that. You can see the massive amount of libertarians that now exist in the country, but we haven't yet reached a critical mass where the country's ready to shift. Most Americans still want to place their faith in statism and socialism, interventionism. They convince themselves it's freedom and free enterprise and so forth. And but they're going to get mugged by reality, because you see, there is no one among the statist community that advocates that any of these programs be drastically reduced. I mean, look at Social Security. What are the chances they're going to slash Social Security by 50%. I mean, now the Social Security recipients will scream, louder than the Greek people who are, demanding their dole. Um, I mean, and then, you got all the mainstream media saying, oh, he wants to tamper with Social Security and all this, so they give out all the statist fear mongering on Social Security. So you're not going to see any cuts there. You're not going to see any cuts in Medicare. I mean, even Romney, every time he gave a speech, he had this placard. Well, in Florida, he had this placard on his podium saying, "I'm a fierce defender of Medicare," or something to that effect. Um, and the recipients of Medicare, I mean, they're a powerful lobby. They're not going to let go of their dole, and then they got the Medicaid, got the farm subsidies. Farmers aren't going to cut anything, and then you got the military, the giant warfare state, the occupation of Afghanistan, the military bases all over the world, including here in the United States, the vast standing army. I mean, there, what are we going to hear as soon as somebody suggests a drastic cut in the military? National security, and same with CIA. You propose slashing spending on the CIA, national security, and then those are the biggies. And when you got the little tiny ones, what's always their answer? Like funding for the arts and that sort of stuff. They say, oh, well, it's such a minute part of the budget. It's not going to affect anything anyway, so let's not change it. It's just so tiny. What's the point of eliminating that or reducing that? So it doesn't look real good about reining in federal spending. I mean, right now the government, as everybody knows, is spending $1.3 trillion a year more than what they're bringing in. Okay, that means that every year they're adding $1.3 trillion to the accumulated debt. Now, how does this work? Okay, well, let's get down to basics. The government collects its tax revenues, and that's a certain amount, and then it spends a certain amount. Now, theoretically, it could spend what it collects in taxes. Okay, a quote balanced budget. So let's say it collects, $1 trillion in taxes. It spends $1 trillion. Okay, so things are balanced. That's not what they do. They're spending $1.3 trillion more than what they're bringing in taxes. That's the so-called deficit, the difference between what they're spending and what they're bringing in taxes. Where do they get that extra money? They get it by borrowing. They go into the markets and they squeeze out private businessmen and people that are trying to borrow money. They outbid them and they get this $1.3 trillion in cash. And then they spend it, on the salaries for the troops or, bribes in Afghanistan or, subsidies for the farmers or payments for the Social Security recipients, whatever. But they're spending that much more because they're borrowing. That debt is added on to the total amount of the debt of the U.S. government, which continues to mount. Now, the Congress has acknowledged implicitly that too much debt is a very bad thing. It's a very dangerous thing. And that acknowledgement comes in the form of this debt ceiling. That what they're doing with a ceiling is they're saying, okay, this is the maximum amount of debt that the U.S. government will be permitted to incur, because otherwise, if they go over that, it's dangerous. And that's an acknowledgement by even the Congress, the big spending Congress, that this is a bad situation. The problem is that every time they reach this limit, which they themselves say is the limit, the mainstream press goes ballistic and says, that can't be the limit. You just please raise it one more time. Let us borrow more money, just one more time. And so they raise it up, but then from that point forward to the new time that the new debt ceiling is reached, they keep spending. And the mainstream press never says, hey, look, we were lucky last time that the Congress raised the debt ceiling, but now we're up against a ceiling, 2 years from now. We've got to slash spending. Oh, no. They're laughing. They say, ha, we scared them last time. We'll do it again when it comes up. And it does. It comes up every time. And what the Congress does is they keep raising that ceiling, raising the ceiling, so it effectively becomes no ceiling at all. And you see this reflected in I think it was Moody's, the credit reporting agency, downgraded U.S. Debt. I mean, they're essentially saying it's like you know with a credit rating. You know, people have credit ratings when they get too high on their credit cards and they miss a couple of payments or whatever. You know that there's a downgrade on the credit rating. That's what Moody's, or I think it was Moody's, the credit rating agency, did to the U.S. government. It's a sign. It's a signal that things are getting precarious. Now, it's much worse than you think, though, because it's not just the debt that matters here. It's all these unfunded liabilities, you know, like Social Security, Medicare. I mean, look at how many people, the baby boomers, are now reaching into their senior years. Every day there's more. And guess who's making those payments? The young and the productive. But those payments that are going to have to be made over the next, you know, 20 years, 25, 30 years, they're not listed as part of the indebtedness on the government's balance sheet. So when we talk about the national debt, it doesn't include the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid payments, farm subsidies, aid to dictatorships, and all these other things. Why? Well, because they're not liabilities in the accounting sense of the term. That is to say, there's no legal obligation to pay them as there is with a bond. I mean, that's a contract. The government signed. I borrow money. I owe you this amount. Here's your promissory note or your bond or bill or whatever. But with Social Security, they could repeal it today. And yeah, I know what the seniors say. Oh, Jacob, I have a contract. I signed the contract. I know I did back in 1961. I remember my parents signing the contract. Oh, it's all nonsense. Okay? It's self-delusion. There's never been a contract. There's never been a fund. Okay? Social Security is a straight confiscate from the young and transfer to the old. That's what the whole thing is. Medicare, Medicaid, all welfare programs, food stamps, and so forth. But there's not a legal obligation to pay it. It's always been a welfare program that's funded by a welfare tax, the Social Security tax or the FICA tax or the payroll tax, whatever label you want to put on it. It didn't have to have a special tax. It could have been just funded out of the income tax. It's just a welfare program. But there's no legal obligation to pay it. And that's why they don't add it onto the national debt or to the balance sheet. So when you hear about the national debt, things are much worse than that. That's assuming that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and the farm subsidies and so forth continue in existence, which by all accounts, they're going to. So for all practical purposes, people, the working class, the young people, the people starting out life, you're going to be paying these bills. Not just the national debt bills, but all the unfunded liabilities that are growing every day. I mean, look how many baby boomers there are. They're going to be drawing on Medicare and Social Security and so forth. So, you know, in order to analyze this thing and figure out what the solution is, you know, I thought I'd break it down a little bit into basic terms. Because, you know, the mainstream press acts as if, you know, this is just one giant free enterprise society in which there's businesses and industries and small businesses and workers and the government and everybody's a player in the economy, you see, and they talk in terms of, hey, we need growth, we need jobs, you know, and the industries ought to be hiring people and the government ought to be hiring people, and let's all get together and have growth and so forth. Well, what they're talking about here is that the more people they get to work, the more the tax revenues can go up to sustain the welfare state and the warfare state. And now, what do I mean by this? Well, you know, while statists look at all these players in the economy as sort of all part of the same team, that's not reality. And that's not the way we libertarians, who like to deal with reality, look at it. The only way to look at this is that the government is in a separate category. That is to say, there are two sectors here we're dealing with. We're dealing with the private sector, which is the wealth-producing sector, and then we're dealing with the public sector, the government sector, which is the wealth-confiscating sector. And that's a vitally important distinction that everybody needs to remember. Okay, here's the private sector producing wealth. people engaging in private enterprise, whether working in a business or starting a business or owning a business. And, I mean, they're engaging in their life's work, and they're making money through interactions with other people, economic interactions, trades, contracts, just going shopping or investing or whatever. You got all this complex mutuality of coordinated efforts in the private sector, which is producing wealth. And people save a little bit, they sock it away. Now, obviously, people are not saving very much now, but we'll see why that's so in a few minutes. But fundamentally, people save a little bit, they put it in the bank, and that money is now available as capital to be loaned out to businessmen who want better equipment, better tools to make their workers more productive. And then when the worker becomes more productive, that increases revenues, in which case, wages rise. And this is one of the big messages that Adam Smith outlined in his famous treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith was trying to determine what it was that made certain nations wealthier than other nations. And he said, well, it's one of the reasons is because in the private, if the private sector is relatively free of taxation and confiscation of wealth and so forth, that's the sector that produces the capital that makes people more productive, which raises standards of living. For example, suppose you've got people working on a farm, using hoes to plant the seeds and harvest the crop and so forth. And at the end of the year, they all take, there are 10 workers, they take $100 savings to the bank, they put it in the bank. And the farmer goes to the bank and says, hey, I'm interested in going and buying a tractor, but I don't have the money. Can you lend me $1,000? And the banker says, well, your workers just came in and deposited $1,000. I got the money to lend to you. So the farmer goes to the tractor business and they say, well, we don't have one available, but we can make one with you. We'll have it ready in a month. And so all of a sudden demand increases for workers in the tractor industry because demand for tractors is going up. They may even lure some of the workers away from the guy's farm by offering higher wages. And so the guy gets his tractor in a month, gives it to the workers. They produce, instead of 100 bushels of wheat, 1,000 bushels of wheat. And now the farmers got more money to pay wages. And this is the way standards of living rise, through the private sector and through the accumulation of wealth and capital. Well, then the government comes along and just confiscates wealth. That's the way governments sustain themselves. And that comes as a big shock to a lot of people. It came as a shock to me before I discovered I was a libertarian. I mean, I just thought the government had its own money like everybody else has its own money. It never occurred to me that the only way government got its money was by confiscating wealth out of the private sector. But that's how it happens. I mean, suppose like the private sector is producing, $1 million of wealth a year, and the government comes in and confiscates half of it. Well, to that extent, that's half the standard of living that they've now impeded, damaged, destroyed. And what do they use this money for? Oh, well, they build a bridge with it. And they say, oh, look at the jobs we produce with our bridge. Oh, man, we are fantastic. Vote for us, restore us to office. And the mainstream press goes gaga over this. I mean, it's really funny to see their commentaries of, my gosh, look how effective this congressman is. He has brought home this bridge and this community center and this highway. And wow, he is so effective. Well, all he's done is use his power and influence to confiscate wealth from another portion of the nation, from those people in the producing private sector, and redirected it over here. So when they point to, the jobs came from this highway, or this bridge, or this contract that's going to Afghanistan or something, always keep in mind what they don't point to is what is unseen. This is what Frederick Bastiat, the 19th century French free market legislator, pointed out, and Henry Hazlitt pointed out in his great book, Economics in One Lesson. You got to focus on what is unseen. And what is unseen is all the jobs that did not come into existence because people weren't free to do what they wanted with that portion of the wealth that was confiscated. So all the government's doing is confiscating wealth, destroying all those jobs and opportunities and rising standards of living in order to redirect it over here to pay soldiers and so forth. Um, and now they reach a point, inevitably. I mean, theoretically, they can confiscate X amount of wealth and then just spend it, and that'll be done. That would be bad enough, because gradually the system starts to crater in on itself, because people start realizing, hey, why should I work when I can go on the dole? And so you have the private sector slowly starting to crater in on itself. But what happens is they end up spending much more than they bring in. This is what happens with Greece. I mean, they were spending so much money that they had to go out and start borrowing it. And they were lying to the people, concealing how much they were borrowing. And finally, the markets ferreted it out. The speculators figured it out. And people say, we're not lending more money to you. We won't get paid back. And they're busted, bankrupt. And the Greek people don't understand this. It's very fascinating. It's like what I just said a few minutes ago. They have no idea that the government gets its money by confiscating wealth from the private sector. They operate under the sense that the government must have its own money. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. The government's like a private company. It's got its own money, and it's just a matter of being recalcitrant and evil and selfish and greedy that it doesn't want to continue paying the dole to the Greek people. They don't understand that the private sector, it's not there to cover the dole anymore. I mean, they could confiscate everything in the private sector. It's sort of like Cuba did, what North Korea did, where they just took everybody's mansion and everybody's business and industry and doled it out to the poor. But I mean, that's a one-time deal. Then everybody ends up working for the state, as they have been in Cuba and North Korea and so forth. And so that's not a solution to the Greek problem. And obviously they can't borrow any more money because people won't lend it to them. They can't inflate the currency, which is the U.S. government's time-honored way of paying off excess debt. They just get the Federal Reserve to print the money to pay off the creditors in cheap and debased dollars. They can't do that because they're in the Eurozone, and the Germans won't permit inflation. They had their own experience with inflation, and they know that just cheap and debased dollars isn't going to accomplish anything in the long term. All it's going to do is create this sense of monetary debauchery that destroys moral values, and it's just a form of sophisticated stealing. It's a default, and that's of course what the Federal Reserve is for, to commit this fraud of financing the debt by paying off creditors in cheap and debased dollars. It may not work this time because, to finance their wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they went to the Chinese communist regime and asked them to lend them the money. And the Chinese communists said, okay. Well, now the U.S. government's in hock to the Chinese communists, who have said, don't even think about paying us off in cheap and debased dollars. We know that trick. And they have their own central bank, their own Federal Reserve. You're not going to do this to us. And so now the Fed, they don't quite know what to do here, because there's always a chance that the Chinese just may dump all their holdings. And, the state to say, oh, they would never do that because they would lose too much money. Well, they would do it if by holding on to the cheap and to the debt they would lose more money. Then it's rational to just go ahead and dump it and take your beating. So if that happened, I mean, you'd see a real monetary crisis. And of course, the dangers of the monetary crisis is that you end up with more dictatorial power in the part of the government. I mean, we've seen the dictatorial power with the terrorist emergency, 9/11, where they decreed that they now had the power that dictatorial regimes throughout history have had, the power to round people up, torture them, incarcerate them without trial, including Americans. Now the power to assassinate Americans. I mean, we've seen what emergencies do. And this isn't a no-brainer. I mean, dictatorships have always used emergencies to decree these special, extraordinary, temporary powers. I mean, that's how the Egyptian dictatorship has all these powers, the same powers to round people up, incarcerate them without trial because of an emergency that took place 30 years ago. So we've seen what happens with that type of emergency. But if we go back to like the Chilean military coup of 1973, which happened on 9/11, interestingly enough, that was in response to an economic emergency when Pinochet took power with the full support of the U.S. national security state, the Pentagon and the CIA. rounding up people, torturing them, raping them. And he said it was a war on communism. He didn't need to do due process. Or use the same rationale as the war on terrorism. No due process, no trials, no anything, because they were at war with the communists. And they killed some 3,000 people, including 2 Americans. Murders that the CIA participated in. And of course, we don't know the details of that because the Congress and the Justice Department wouldn't dare investigate them. It was the CIA after all. And so we still don't know the details of how the CIA participated in those murders, but we know that there's a State Department doctrine, a document that acknowledged that the CIA did participate at least in the murder of Charles Horman, these 2 young American men, and Horman was one of them. So my point is that an economic emergency is just as dangerous to liberty and can be just as dangerous. I mean, look at the extraordinary powers that Franklin Roosevelt assumed during the Great Depression. You know, seizing everybody's gold. I mean, what's that all about? Gold was the official money of the American people for more than 100 years. And now he made it a felony offense to own gold, to be caught with what had been the official money of our American ancestors, of the founding fathers, the framers. And of course, he had his infamous Blue Eagle campaign, which was, it was right out of Benito Mussolini's playbook. And it's very dangerous. In Argentina, when they had this big crisis where the government couldn't pay its debts, to get money, guess what they did? They just seized everybody's 401ks, their retirement accounts. I mean, look at all the 401ks in this country. They're like ripe plums, right? SEPs, IRAs, everything. If the government is desperately in need of money and there's a huge monetary crisis, there's a run on the dollar, is the government going to resist the temptation to just seize this plum? Oh, they'll replace it with government bonds, which are going to be depreciating in value because of the massive inflation. But that's what Argentina did. Impossible to know, but it could get very nasty. And all of this is because of this out of control spending. Now, some people say the solution is to, reduce spending and increase taxes. They're only partially right. The only solution is to slash spending. Don't raise the taxes. That's just going to take more money out of the productive sector. Slash the spending, lay off the workers, lay off the soldiers, the whole thing. Bring out end the occupations, the invasions. Slash it down to where the spending equals the taxes. But even that's not enough. You see, even when some conservatives suggest such a thing, and very few of them do, it's not enough. And this is where we libertarians come in. It's time for the American people to ask a fundamental question. What is the role of government in a free society? What do we want government to be doing? Do we want government to be taking care of people? Because that's what socialism's all about. It's what paternalism's all about. Is that a free society? Or is a free society where people are free to engage in economic enterprise without government interference, without regulation, without permits, mutually beneficial exchanges with anyone in the world, including people that they have all these sanctions and embargoes against, and to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth and then decide for themselves what to do with it? In other words, no coerced charity at all. No coerced retirement planning. That everybody has the responsibility of making these decisions on their own. Will somebody be irresponsible? Yeah. I mean, everybody's got his own definition of responsibility. But this is the essence of a free society. That's what it means to be free. It's not this sense of, oh, freedom is when the government's taking care of you and it's got a safety net and it's forcing you to be good and it's forcing you to be caring, forcing you to be responsible. Nonsense. That's just anti-freedom, antithetical to the principles of a free society. So that's why we libertarians don't get involved in this nonsense of, well, who's the better manager of the economy, Romney or Obama? I mean, the idea is that government, the problems we have in this country is because government is managing the economy, because we have a welfare state, because we have a warfare state. The only solution is to challenge the role of government in this society now. And we do that by going back to our heritage of liberty, to our founding principles. And when we do that, there ain't no welfare state. There isn't any Social Security. There wasn't for over 100 years of this country's history because Americans said no to socialism. They said no to interventionism. They said no to imperialism. They said yes to freedom and free markets, with big exceptions. Okay, nobody denies it. Slavery was a horrific exception. They had tariffs. There's a lot of minor exceptions, economic regulations. But no one can deny there was no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no drug laws, no immigration controls, no gun control, no farm subsidies, no aid to dictatorships, no standing army, no foreign aid, no empire. It was the most unusual society in history. And that was how the standard of living of the American people soared. That's, by the way, the most charitable nation in history, especially in the late 1800s when capital accumulation was mounting. But that's the solution. A new paradigm that replaces the paradigm of statism, a new paradigm based on freedom and free markets, where we lead the world out of this statist nonsense. That's the show. Thanks for listening in, and see you next week.